In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make an under-the-sea cake with jelly. I'll show you a few variations, as well as tips and tricks for the easiest and most successful way to create one of these eye-catching and delicious cakes. First, let's make the cake part of the cake. You'll need a springform pan for this, which is usually used for cheesecakes. They're the ones you can clip and unclip to separate the base and the outer ring. Take a few layers of whatever flavour cake you like and chill them in the fridge for an hour so they're cold and firm. You'll need a serrated knife, an offset spatula, and a rubber or silicone spatula. Place your first cake layer on the base of the springform pan, level the cake if it's domed, and then add your filling. I'm using my 4-minute buttercream to fill and frost my cake, but you can use whatever you like, although it's easiest to use a firm filling, like this, rather than something runny, like lemon curd or a fruit puree, because even if you pipe a buttercream dam around the filling to hold it in place, when you carve the cake, if you carve off that dam, your filling will ooze out of the cake. Now carve your cake into some form of a dome by trimming the top edge off with a serrated knife so that the cake is curved around the top. It can be simple like this, with just a few cuts to create the dome, or you can be much more elaborate, carving nooks and crannies into the top and sides of your cake. 3 things are really important here. First, keep in mind that if you want the maximum amount of cake and filling, a domed shape is best, because then the cake layers will fill the middle of the cake, with a thin layer of jelly completely covering it on top and around the sides, to create the effect of being under the sea. Cakes are easiest to carve when they're cold, because they're less crumbly, so you can even freeze them for an hour if they're falling apart as you cut them. It's fine for the cake to look messy as you carve it, because this is just the beginning of the process. You can use any cake you've cut off, attaching it to the cake with a bit of buttercream to build onto it. Okay, so thirdly, the most important thing when you're carving the cake is that the sides of the cake are at least 1 centimetre, or ½ inch, within the edge of the base of the springform pan, so that there's room for frosting and then for the jelly to fill in the space around the outside of the cake. If you want to, you can frost the bottom part of the cake all the way up to the edge of the base of the pan, so it looks like sand sticking out at the bottom of the cake, but you'll still need to carve the cake smaller than the pan now, so that there's room for that frosting. Cover the cake with a thin layer of frosting, and this is called a crumb coat, because if any crumbs come off the cake and get into the frosting, they'll be trapped in this layer of frosting, so when you spread on more frosting later, the crumbs won't get into that layer. Put the cake in the fridge for about 30 minutes to set this crumb coat, and now I'll show you one of the ways to make the fish to swim in the jelly part of this cake. You'll need a silicone mould for this and some white chocolate chips. Microwave the chocolate at 50% power in the microwave for a minute to melt it without burning it, and stir it until it's smooth. You can microwave it again if there are still lumps in the chocolate. Once it's smooth, divide it into a few bowls and add a drop of gel colour to each one. You can use oil-based colours if you have them, but the gels you use for frosting are fine if you don't add a huge amount and if you don't overstir the chocolate. So for this bowl, I added a big drop of gel, and there's just a tiny bit of chocolate in the bowl, so it's seized up. But for these other colours, with a smaller drop of colour and more chocolate in the bowl, the gels work perfectly. Use a paintbrush to brush the coloured chocolate into the fish mould, using more than one colour within the same fish to make it look a bit more interesting and realistic. I'm using the purple chocolate that's seized, and since the fish is going to be within jelly on the cake, if there's any texture or graininess in the seized chocolate, you won't be able to see it. Wipe off any chocolate around the edges of the fish with an offset spatula, and don't worry if the backs of the fish aren't smooth because they're going to be pressed against the cake so you won't see them. Put the fish in the fridge for about 30 minutes to set, and then flip them out of the mould and admire how pretty they look. The jelly will give them a shimmery and wet effect later. If some of the fish snap as you take them out of the mould, don't throw them away. You can easily attach a broken tail or fin when you put the fish on the cake. Now we're going to frost the cake with sand, or frosting that looks like sand. Make the colour of buttercream you want with yellow and brown gels, and you can mix a few different shades if you want to create some variation. I'm just going to use plain white buttercream and yellow. You can use ganache if you prefer, it doesn't have to be buttercream. Spread it all over the cake and smooth it a bit with your offset spatula, but it's fine if it's rugged and uneven, because only the general shape and colour will be visible through the jelly. If you're using chocolate fish, press those into the frosting now while the frosting is still sticky. The further in from the edges of the cake, the more blurry they'll be, more like subtle blobs of colour than actual fish, so you'll hardly notice this one at the end. If any of the fish broke when you took them out of the mould, just press both parts into the frosting to piece the fish back together. When you position your fish, choose the outermost parts of the cake because then the fish will be most visible through the jelly. If the frosting on your cake has set before you do this, just spread on a little bit of fresh frosting wherever you want to put a fish and press it into that frosting. If you're going to leave the bottom part of the frosting visible, like on this cake, after you frost the cake, put it in the fridge for an hour to set the frosting and then scrunch up a piece of foil and wrap it around the cake, pressing to imprint some random texture into the frosting so it looks like grains of sand. I'm doing the whole cake here, but when the cake is finished you really don't notice the texture if there's jelly over it, so it's only worth doing the section of frosting that's going to be exposed. Now we're going to make the jelly. You'll need 3 ounces, or 85 grams, of gelatin and 1 cup of water. And just to prepare you, if you're going to use little packets of gelatin, you'll need a lot of them. Pour the gelatin and water into a bowl and leave it for 5 minutes for the gelatin to bloom, which will make the jelly smooth and also firm. Put half a cup, or 100 grams, of sugar into a pan with 2 cups of water and bring it to a boil over medium heat, so that all of the sugar dissolves. Take the pan off the stove, or just turn the heat off, and add the gelatin mixture to the pan, stirring until it's all melted. If there are any clumps of gelatin left, lift them out with a spoon. Add a teaspoon of whatever flavour you like. I'm using almond for this, since I think it will pair nicely with a banana chocolate cake, but fruity flavours like lemon or any berry are maybe more expected. Now for the second way to make fish. Set aside a little bit of jelly now and tint the rest blue with just a drop or 2 of blue gel. This is going to be the ocean. Use another colour for the little ball of gelatin, something that will show through the blue jelly, so pink is a great option, or you can do a few bowls of different colours. Use a measuring spoon or a turkey baster to fill in the fish shapes. If the gelatin overflows, dip a paper towel into it to mop it up. Put the mould in the fridge for an hour and then push the fish out. Gelatin fish are easier to cut through when you serve a cake than white chocolate fish, and you can use the gelatin you're making anyway instead of needing another ingredient like you do for the white chocolate fish. But the colours and texture of the gelatin fish aren't as visible through the jelly ocean on the cake as on the white chocolate fish. When you see my finished cakes with both types of fish, you can choose which ones you prefer. Finally, we're going to create the jelly ocean. Cut a piece of acetate so it's long enough to wrap around your cake, and at least as high as you want your cake to be. Spray it with oil and wipe the oil with a paper towel so that there's a thin coating all over the acetate. If you're enjoying this tutorial, subscribe to my channel for a new cake decorating tutorial every week, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss one. If you haven't already, take the ring off your springform pan and place your cake on the base. The cake needs to be cold for this so that the frosting is firm and doesn't get damaged when you move the cake around and wrap it with the acetate. Make sure the cake is in the middle of the pan, with at least 1/2 centimetre or 1/4 inch all the way around if you want the entire sides of the cake to be jelly. I'll show you the alternative in a minute. Wrap the acetate around the cake, around the base of the springform pan, and pull it tight. And then tape the outer end of the acetate, where it overlaps the rest of the acetate, to make a tight seam from the top to the bottom. Place the cake on the base onto a piece of cling film or saran wrap and lift the plastic up to wrap it around the acetate and tape it down. Then lower the ring of the springform pan down over the acetate and connect it to the base. I wrapped this cake around the outside of the pan instead of the inside, and that doesn't work as well, and I'll show you why next. I definitely recommend wrapping the acetate with cling film or saran wrap first, and taping it around the acetate so it's tightly wrapped, and then lowering the springform pan down over it. The purpose of the cling film and tape is to make sure the jelly doesn't leak out of the acetate, but you can place your cake in a bowl just in case. Once the jelly has cooled, but before it sets, pour it slowly over the cake. Aim to hit the cake somewhere there isn't a fish so you don't risk knocking it off the frosting where you placed it. If the jelly has cooled and the cake is chilled so the frosting is firm, the jelly won't melt the frosting or blend with it, it will just sit on top of it. You can see a bit of jelly leaking out down here, so the bowl is a good idea just in case. If you wrap the acetate with cling film before you clip on the ring of the springform pan, you shouldn't have any leaking though. For this cake, you can see that at the bottom of the dome, the frosting on the cake goes right up to the acetate wrapped around it, so there's no room for jelly, so the sand frosting will be on the outside of the cake at the bottom. Place gelatin fish around your cake and pour the gelatin over the top, keeping the fish on the edges of the cake so they'll be more visible. Put the cake in the fridge for an hour to set the jelly and then unclip the springform pan, peel the tape off the acetate and unwrap the acetate. Lift the cake off the springform base and spread some buttercream on a cake board or a plate to secure the cake onto it. If you want the bottom of the cake to be only frosting so that the jelly ocean starts a bit higher, you can carefully peel off any thin patches of jelly that manage to get around the cake and down to that bottom section. If there's any stray gelatin at the top of the cake, above the top edge, you can trim it off with scissors. This happens when some jelly leaks out of the cling film at the bottom, and the jelly part of the cake sinks a little bit lower, leaving some residue behind, higher up on the acetate, where the top level of the jelly used to be. If you want to add some edible sand around the bottom of the cake, pipe frosting around the base and straight away pour some brown sugar or crushed graham crackers onto the cake board and push them gently into the frosting up against the cake. You can use any piping tip, it doesn't have to be round, or just squeeze the frosting out of a hole at the end of the bag without a piping tip. You can flatten the piped frosting with an offset spatula before adding the sugar or crumbs if you want, but it's not necessary because when you press the edible sand against the frosting, you'll flatten it anyway. Cut the cake just like you'd cut into any other cake. You'll have to use a bit of pressure to cut through the white chocolate fish. It's fun having two very different flavours and textures in the same slice of cake, and the cross-section of the cake looks stunning. If you aren't happy with your cake after removing the acetate, pull the jelly parts away from the frosted cake and put them in the microwave at 50% power for 30 seconds at a time to melt the jelly again. Make any changes you want to your cake, and then wrap it in acetate again, tape it with cling film, reattach the springform pan, and once the jelly is cool, pour it over the cake. I hope this video has given you the tips and confidence to make your own under-the-sea jelly cake. Please tag me in your photos on Instagram so I can see your creation. For my free online course, go to britishgirlbakes.com and you'll also find all of my recipes and tutorials there. And my online cake school with courses for every skill level on baking and cake decorating. Thanks for watching!